So I'd like to start by thanking David Odoricio and Joe Cambray for inviting me to speak here at this conference. I've been passionately interested, as Joe mentioned, in alchemy and transformation for a long time. And it's a pleasure to have an opportunity to present some of my further ideas about alchemy here at Pacifica. And where else could you get such preludes to a presentation than at Pacifica? Many years ago, in an essay I wrote entitled Fire in the Stone, an inquiry into the alchemy of soul-making, I cited James Hillman, who said, "Soul-making has as its goal a resurrection in beauty and pleasure." And he continues in a curious way, saying that you and I crown matter and have been crowning matter many times, perhaps since childhood. And then he said, recall the stones. Now, I've been recalling stones for a long time. My interest in stones has a long history, and this recollection still has fire in it. As a child, the discovery of stones filled me with an odd pleasure. I loved to play in the dirt and saw the dark earth as a cosmos teeming with life. And then there were the stones, alive and yet dead. They were precious to me, and I reveled in their beauty and in their variety of shape, size, color, and texture. I collected them, and I returned to this play daily. There was something enigmatic and foreign about them, yet in some way more intimate than the world of human discourse. With stones, I was alone, yet not alone. They held a secret, and my secret was with them. As I grew up and this experience began to fade, I continued to have moments of reconnection with the place in my soul that was touched by them. I remember one night having a vision of being something like an anthropologist from another world in the future. I had landed on Earth and was walking around, and everything seemed new, interesting, particularly the stones scattered on the ground. They had a numinous aura, as if they were jewels lying there free for all to enjoy an open treasure. Over the years, I have continued to take pleasure in and wonder about stones. I would occasionally bring them home and set them on a shelf or desk, enjoy their natural beauty that continued for many years, and they contained memories from childhood and extended into a mystery that seemed to stand on a threshold between myself and some other, between life and the beyond, between ego and the unknown. It was on the unknown that began and ended with stone, with an elementary sensate engagement with matter and with what matters, and my attempt to express this experience in my writing. At its origin, I imagine this desire began for me as a kind of primordial arche writing. Arche writing is a term used by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida to refer to a kind of writing that is already there before we use it. It is pre-given, though malleable. It can at times be seen in cultures that do not even employ writing. It is seen in notches on the rope or barrel, fixed customs, or placements around living areas. It is a writing that exists between the inner meaning and outer representation, a form of language that cannot be conceptualized within what Derrida called the metaphysics of presence. Derrida argued that arche writing goes beyond the simple division between writing and speech and proceeds both. My intention here is not to use the term in any strict or scholarly sense, but merely to refer to a very early, perhaps archetypal memory of the origin of my fascination with stones, and ultimately with the Philosopher's Stone. As a young child, I would write with stones by scraping them on the sidewalk. Each stone had a different texture and produced a different kind of mark or color. I noticed that some stones were very hard, and when I would try to write with them or make marks or draw with them, they would produce only a thin white line or scratch on the cement. Other very soft stones would mark the sidewalk with rich color, but would crumble in the process. Other stones would produce a vivid color, but would maintain their consistency without falling apart. I discovered that the hard stones gave little or nothing of their substance. They would last, but were unproductive. The soft stones would use themselves up in a single act of writing. And the stones that I seemed to like best would last, and I could use them again and again to write and draw. Their secret seemed to be that they were not too hard or too soft, and as a result would yield part of their substance without giving themselves away. Something about this experience of the stone and color remains with me. I suspect that each of these stones express a different way of being, and each of these ways of being can be seen as a complexity of psyche or soul, lived differently by different people. My collection of stones grew daily until there was a considerable pile in front of our house. One day when I went to play or write with them again, I was shocked to find that they were all gone. I learned that my grandmother had asked my aunt to clean up in front of the house, and my stones were disposed of, strewn in the woods across a street I was forbidden to cross. My stones were valued treasures, painstakingly collected and nearly numinous. I grieved their loss, and a search began to reclaim whatever it was that they meant to me, lost objects of childhood set in motion, a deep and mostly unknown craving for something elusive, a treasure hard to attain. I've also wondered about my unconscious call to stones. It is interesting that my name, Stanton, comes from a linguistic root which means from the stone house. And oddly, stones, as my namesake, have followed me through my life into my writing about the Philosopher's Stone. Some time ago, I was writing a dissertation on philosophy, and I was telling Joe and Dave at dinner and Pat that when I was writing that, I was amused to realize that without any conscious intent, one of my readers was Ed Casey, who came from Stony Brook, and my thesis advisor's name was Tom Rockmore, a Hegelian scholar. As a teenager, the wondrous feelings I had about stones and color reemerged when I received the gift of a chemistry set and began to perform those now ritual and classic experiments of changing a colorless solution into a brilliant color. The color transformations fascinated me. One drop of clear fluid into a test tube of another clear fluid, and it turned a stunning blue or red. Then add another solution. I can still smell the phenolphthalein, and it would become colorless again. These experiences were enhanced by the text that described them. An old Skillcraft chemistry manual stated that a good magician needs to be prepared, and he described these colors in experiences in provocative ways. Here are some of the ways that they were described. Magic breath, turning wine into water, stealing the blue from the sky, turning the night to sunrise, capturing green of grass, magic water, secret messages, the red witch, turning the night to sunrise, and so on, all magical and provocative images. Beyond my Skillcraft manual, I learned about textures and smells of black powders, yellow sulfur, deep red explosive phosphorus, green crystals, the pleasures of fire, heating, boiling, evaporating, distilling, and making gunpowder, the thrill of spontaneous combustion by throwing sodium into water or placing a drop of glycerin on potassium permanganate and watching it burst into flame. This world was alive, an organic world of living substances, changing shape, form, and appearances. My grandfather built a laboratory room for me in the basement, and on the counters and shelves I amassed chemicals and glassware, test tubes and flasks, beakers of every shape, graduated cylinders, funnels, condensers, and retorts, alcohol lamps and Bunsen burners, ready to make and hold the magic of further adventure. These were my alembics, and I spent many an hour in this corner of my cellar in Psyche. It is clear now that the skillcraft descriptions were meant to interest young children in natural science of chemistry. And for me, it worked. I looked forward to high school, and I thought you could actually study this wonderful world of alchemistry. But much to my disappointment, as I sat in a typical high school chemistry class, the only experiment I now remember was one I lamented, the evaporation of the magic I had anticipated. The deep enjoyment I had in my early exploration was shared with a friend who, like me, had a lab in his basement. But I soon discovered that he lived on another wavelength, and that his interests led him to chemical equations and mathematics. His interests were more abstract and natural scientific, ideas like hard stones, mine in the aesthetics of transformation, and a mystery I still knew little about. He found a home in high school chemistry and ultimately became a physician. After the first part of my high school chemistry semester, I had lost interest in chemistry, and it was a long time before I found alchemy. As I look back now at the old Skillcraft chemistry manual, I see I had not noticed a certain telling passage. It said, quote, "There really is nothing mysterious about chemistry, no magic in it. Everything that happens when elements and compounds react in chemical change can be explained exactly scientifically." Page 3. This pronouncement proved true. The magic was gone. But for me, the vessels of natural science did not exhaust my love of color and change, of stone and the magic that was there in my early laboratory. It is no wonder, perhaps today, that we are so interested in the inner child and the lost objects of desire discussed in psychoanalytic theory. Modernity has gone through a radical secularization of life, and the instinct for the symbolic, philosophical, and even the sacred was suppressed, split off, sublimated, made banal, or literalized to the extent that the body and its sensate magical connections to life are sometimes lost, and numbers and formulas have lost their symbolic Pythagorean and ritual references. And so the foundation of my personality carries a bias, a divide between the hard science and the softer sciences and arts, between abstract ideas and the aesthetics of the imagination. I was in love with the imagination and images, and my commitment to the psyche was with its fundamental importance of images. According to Hillman, Jung never deserted psyche in search of explanatory principles outside of its own imaginal world. I believe this is what Edinger also meant when he noted, as Jung studied alchemy, he found that the luxuriant network of images was indeed Psyche's own waters, which could be used to understand the complex contents of Psyche. For Jung, Edinger, and Hillman, the fundamental facts of Psyche's existence are fantasy images. For them, image is Psyche, while for some, this casts a theoretical shadow of its own. Yet, I continue to find it a vital first principle of imagination. And yet there's something true about the shadow that's left. That's something for another paper, though. I'd like to now begin with a couple of epigraphs and some visual images. The first epigraph: "The divine darkness is that unapproachable light where God is said to live." Pseudo-Dionysus, letter 5. Another epigraph: "Everything tends to make us believe that there exists a certain point of the mind at which life and death, the real and the imagined, past and future, the communicable and the incommunicable, high and low, cease to be perceived as contradictions." André Breton, Manifestos of Surrealism. This image is of an alchemist in his laboratory or study, or both, observing with pleasure and curiosity, if not astonishment, an illuminated feminine figure emerging from his retort, surrounded by light. I discovered this image when I was teaching in Zurich in a little antique shop, and I was told that the image was produced for Victorian apothecaries to be given to doctors with the intent of portraying the foolishness of old alchemists and promoting the developing science of pharmacy. The theme of light was soon to become central to my own studies, and like the old foolish alchemist, I was fascinated and drawn to the numinosity of the alchemical illumination. I suspect it was also, in part, the foolishness of imagining that a living image could come to life. The theme of light became central to my studies. But the art and alchemy of this light and of transformation is a large and complex subject. There are many approaches to understanding the opus alchemicum and its goals of solidification and the Philosopher's Stone. My approach to this work is from the perspective of a Jungian analyst, which means privileging a certain orientation and point of view. It is a point of view that continued to develop within, around, and on the edges of the Jungian tradition, and for me it remains an open inquiry that continues to intrigue and surprise me. Like Jung, the alchemists were interested in fundamental and elemental change, classically imagined as the transformation of lead into gold, a base substance into a noble one. Jung's revolutionary insight was that the alchemists were not simply concerned with the material world, but were speaking in symbols about the soul and were working simultaneously as much with the imagination as with the literal substances of their art. This shift of focus from the literal to the imaginal, from substance to image and imagination, has its roots in the idea that the alchemists were projecting into a mysterious unknown called matter, another unknown, the unconscious psyche. Thus Jung proclaimed, ignotum per ignotus, his attempt to understand the unknown by a greater unknown. While knowledge about matter and psyche were both obscure in the deepest sense, using the developing idea of the unconscious psyche to understand alchemy opened a new and creative vista. This opening of a psychological approach allowed Jung to understand the alchemical opus in a new way that both revealed and yet preserved the mysteries of transformation. Jung concluded that the gold that the alchemists were trying to produce was not simply the common or vulgar gold, but the aurum non vulgi, or the aureum philosophicum, a philosophical gold. This imaginal, philosophical, and psychic reality was a new category used to understand the mysteries of alchemy, and it became clear to Jung that alchemy was not just interested in the perfection of nature, but also in the creation of the higher human being and in divine salvation and the transformation of the cosmos, with what Aaron Cheek called both, quote, gold-making and God-making. Alchemy was then an opus divinum, a sacred work far more than a simple proto-science of chemistry. It was also a religious philosophy and a psychological and transformational art. Jung came to see alchemy as a precursor and confirmation of his psychology of the unconscious. The wealth of alchemical symbolism and the complexity of its system of transformation added to the richness and depth of Jung's psychology. Over the years, many alchemists and scholars influenced by Jung's work have continued to make important contributions to alchemical studies. My own work has been primarily influenced by Maria Louise von Franz, Edward Edinger, James Hillman, and Wolfgang Giegrick. Each of these thinkers has approached alchemy in different ways. Von Franz and Edinger both amplified and helped others gain access to what they saw as Jung's fundamental and profound insights. Hillman and Giegrick challenge Jung, are iconoclastic, and offer alternative, if related, ways of imagining and thinking about alchemy. My own perspective is rooted in and responds to the tension of ideas catalyzed by these differing ways of coming to terms with the alchemical imagination still unfolding in the Jungian tradition and elsewhere. I once wrote about this in an article after I wrote The Black Sun, using the metaphor of the alchemical stove and its many burners and degrees of heat. At the time, I imagined Jung in one alembic on the back burner, cooking over a low, steady heat, with Hillman and Giegrick in a differently shaped vessel boiling up front, as I was trying to prepare my own concoction, utilizing the vapors produced by them and others to further distill and coagulate the essences necessary for the difficult work of understanding and forwarding an alchemical psychology and its elusive and mysterious goal. Since that time, my experiment in understanding alchemy has shifted a bit. Jung's ideas are back up front, and I find myself returning to consider his work again and again. Currently, I have been focusing on Jung's Mysterium Conjunctionis, his last great work on alchemy. As a book and as an archetypal image, an idea, it is at the core of the alchemical opus and central to Jung's psychology. The Mysterium Conjunctionis as a book has been described as a summa of Jungian psychology. Its first chapter, entitled The Components of the Conjunctio, described the overarching theme of the alchemical work. Jung states, the famous line, the factors which come together in the conjunctio are conceived as opposites, either confronting one another in enmity or attracting one another in love. One way of reading this description is to observe the archetypal energies of enmity and love are fundamental forces in an eternal play of opposites. These forces are both cosmic and universal, as well as aspects of the human soul. The opus of the alchemist can then be understood as entering into relationship with these energies in an attempt to produce a mysterious conjunction essential to the goal of the work. It is not surprising then that Jung cites Karl Karenier's essay on the Aegean festival in Goethe's Faust and its literary prototype of the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz as motivating his writing in the Mysterium. Jung likewise notes that the idea of the chemical wedding is a product of the traditional hieroskamos symbolism of alchemy. The hieroskamos is a Greek word for the sacred marriage, often signifying a ritualized sexual union, symbolic and inclusive of many levels of the conjunctio. It is a union of opposites and a way of opening and linking the deepest recesses of the soul and the cosmos, both human and divine. The Mysterium as a book is the final major statement of Jung's understanding of the alchemical opus. It is also difficult to read, hard to understand, hard to assimilate, and some say it's as difficult to understand as the alchemical texts themselves. Interpretations of the Mysterium are divided, some giving it high praise and profound respect, Edinger, and others relativizing its value, Hillman, and still others dismissing its value, Giegrick and Powers. Hillman tries to avoid any grand narrative that encompasses alchemy within an explanatory theory, such as Jung's conjunction of opposites and the realization of the self, eschewing the temptation to give meaning by translating into universal symbols and noble metaphysics. Both Giegrick and Powers claim that the Mysterium is no longer relevant to the soul, that it is of historical interest only, and so may be discarded. For Edinger, on the other hand, it is so important that he believes it will be a major object of study for centuries. I agree with Edinger that the Mysterium is an important text, though I have no prediction of how it will be regarded in the future. It is Jung's crowning achievement. It describes the opus of alchemy from beginning to end in breathtaking scholarly and psychological depth, and is organized around images that illuminate the archetypal psyche. In his Mysterium Lectures, A Journey Through C.G. Jung's Mysterium Conjunctionis, Edinger demonstrates how Jung guides his reader through over 100 images that mark the path of alchemical transformation, from the war of opposites through the mercurial and central mystery of the conjunctio to the emergence of the arcane substance in the Philosopher's Stone and the self. While my own style of thinking about alchemy is in many ways closer to Hillman's archetypal psychology, I nevertheless find the Mysterium Conjunctionis, both as a book and as a central image of the conjunctio, to be essential, key to understanding the dynamics of psychological transformation. Jung was not always systematic in the way he spoke about the idea of the conjunctio. In a masterful, truly masterful chapter on the opposites, David Henderson, in his new book, 2014, provides a historical and scholarly account of the conjunctio as Jung presents it over the corpus of his collected works. Henderson differentiates the coincidentia oppositorum, the complexio oppositorum, the conjunctio oppositorum, and the unity of opposites. For him, these differing descriptions reflect not only on subtle differences in the meaning of the conjunctio, but also a progressive development of the idea over time. And I'll not reiterate here the subtleties that Henderson describes, but in general, the conjunctio and the transcendent function are attempts to describe what for Jung is an irrational, instinctual, half-bodily, half-spiritual, symbolic process of transforming opposites and contraries, differences, into some kind of unified transcendence. For Jung, the conjunctio opens toward images of wholeness, the birth of the filius philosophorum, the philosophical child, and the self. And the most famous of all alchemical images, the Philosopher's Stone, are emergent images of transcendent wholeness. The soul, then, is the alpha and the omega of the process, and like Mercurius, is the mediator and intermediary of the goal of the work, and has the power to transform earthly man into an illuminated philosopher. The Philosopher's Stone is said to have 1,000 names, and also is nameless and ineffable. Graticola, in his 1652 book, Names of the Philosopher's Stone, mentions dragon, serpent, toad, green lion, quintessence, chameleon, virgin's milk, radical humidity, unctuous moisture, urine, water of the wise men, and other images. A number of the images are related also to light and illumination: gold, sol, sun, lightning, afternoon light, overcoming a cloud, the full moon, our stone, lunaire, fire, the light of lights, but it's also blacker than black, Sol Niger, the black sun, linking both light and darkness, and the list goes on, disseminating itself into a continuing complexity of images, to which I have recently added myself the notion of chiasmos, the unity of chaos and cosmos. Each of these images of the Philosopher's Stone contains a subtle phenomenology that, if followed, opens a unique epiphany, a way into understanding the stone's multiplicity. Despite the many names of the stone, the alchemists stress that it is a personified unity and consists in one thing and one thing only. Maureenus wrote, "For it is one stone, one medicine, in which consists the whole magistery." And the Scala Philosophorum stated, "The stone is one, yet this one is one in number, not one in number, but in kind." Perhaps what the alchemists had in mind was embodied in the stone's most paradoxical and most mysterious description, lithos ou lithos, the stone that is no stone. In this description, the enigmatic quality of the stone shines forth, ultimately what Abraham called the arcanum of all arcana. In this, then, the mystery of the great work, the goal of the opus, the mysterious Philosopher's Stone, is the kind of stone I think Maureenus was talking about. Is this the medicine Maureenus wrote about that contains the whole magistery? Does it carry in itself a self-negation, a via negativa that separates it from literal nature and from any simple positive being or presence? Rather, is it an unknown, an absence, an obscurity, a darkness, or perhaps more accurately, a fundamental paradox that links all binaries into an expression of the mysterium conjunctionis? If this is so, the medicine is also a pharmacon, a poison, as well as a healing draught. One such pharmacon is Sol Niger, the black sun, and as is noted, is one of many symbolic expressions of the stone. As an emergence from the mysterium conjunctionis, It is a conjunction of and primal expression of divine darkness and divine light, unconscious and conscious, knowing and unknowing, ego and self, and the mystical play between these opposing tensions. In general, it reflects a dynamic condensation of the polar character of the archetypal psyche. In the phenomena of Saul Niger, one discovers the blacker-than-black aspects of the psyche, the presence of a dark light, a light that Jung and the alchemists call the light of darkness itself, the lumen natura, the unnatural light of nature. My major focus when writing about the black sun was to explore its darkest aspects and lean toward the exploration of darkness in its darkest depths. But I am also indebted to the study of Saul Niger for its revelation of an intimate linking between it and the mysterious other that shines in that darkness. At the end of the black sun, my interest turned more directly to this other light, and my work began to lean in the direction of exploring it as a manifestation of the goal of alchemical work, the Philosopher's Stone. Turning toward illumination is not simply moving beyond darkness, but seeing further into its paradoxical and mercurial complexity, hesitating at an ontological pivot point between presence and absence, inside and outside, knowing and unknowing, relativizing them, but leaning toward the illumination that emerged in the deconstruction of its binaries. What's the point? The ontological pivot point. In the Paradoxica chapter of the Mysterium, Jung takes up the symbolism of the point, which for him is a creative center where things in being have their first origin. As such, the point is an expression of the divine, which, like Mercurius, appears to be before, beyond, and between binaries. In the Mysterium, this point also symbolizes the Godhead and the light and fire that connects the divine to the scintillae, or to the sparks that shine in the darkness, and then are related to the solificatio, the enlightenment, the gnosis, the illuminated body that dwells in the heart of man. As the light of nature, it is also the radical moisture and the healing balm, the gold of wholeness, and what Jung called the self. While working on the black sun and the multiple names of the Philosopher's Stone, I noticed a strange parallel in an attempt to describe a supreme principle or archetype of divinity in the work of the mystical theologian Pseudo-Dionysius. In his work, The Divine Names, he tries to express and understand God by examining a long list of attributes taken from the Old and New Testament scriptures. Like Gradicoli, with regard to the multiple images of the Philosopher's Stone, Dionysius elaborates names associated with God, including unity and distinction, existence, life, wisdom, reason, power, truth, the great and the small, omnipotence, the Ancient of Days, the peace, the Holy of Holies, the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, God of Gods, perfection, and again, unity. This list of positive affirmative names, referred to as cataphasis, is followed by his work on the mystical theology, often referred to as an apophatic approach, which suggests the limitation of any and all positive attempts to define or to describe God. In the mystical theology, the positive attributes are surpassed by including the Via Negativa, which leads to a new level of mystical understanding of darkness and a hyper-essential designation of the reality of the divine. Just as in alchemy, the stone is not a stone, so in mystical theology, God is not God. This dark image of God as a divine darkness is also illustrated by Meister Eckhart's enigmatic prayer to God, to rid him of God. The Via Negativa is elaborated in the mystical theology, which begins with a question: what is divine darkness? In this treatise, Dionysius is giving instructions to an initiate, intending to guide him to the, quote, topmost height of mystic lore, which exceedeth light and more than exceedeth knowledge, where the simple absolute and unchangeable mysteries of heavenly truth lie hidden in that dazzling obscurity of secret silence, outshining all brilliance with the intensity of a darkness, surcharging our blinded intellect in utter, impalpable, invisible fairness of glories which exceed all beauty. Wow, it's a mouthful. The theme of illumination and divine darkness and divine light is richly differentiated in the work of Henri Corbin. The work is experiential, it's vital, its presentation in the work by Tom Cheetham is masterful. Tom writes about the Via Negativa, the emptying of God in Christian theology, kenosis, and the destiny of the West in the hermeneutics of absence, and the faces of darkness and the faces of light. Cheetham differentiates two kinds of darkness, two sources, two kinds of bewilderment. He describes a darkness that is only darkness, a darkness that refuses light and is demonic, unconscious, and evil. He distinguishes this from another kind of darkness that is not merely black, but is a luminous night, a dazzling darkness, a darkness that approaches the pole. This is the black light that Corbin calls superconsciousness. Cheetham notes that the appearance of black light also marks a moment of supreme danger. The black light signals the annihilation of the ego in the presence of the divine and its unknown origin. It announces that nothing that exists beyond being, beyond all the subtle matter that mirrors the uncanny light. The black light marks the region of absolute, the Dios absconditus, the unknown and unknowable God. How this God's absence is encountered and experienced makes all the difference and is considered a moment of greatest danger. One can become hopelessly swallowed up in the majesty of divine darkness, or one can become initiated and resurrected in the beauty of theophanic revelation, a man of light, perhaps not unlike the soulification of the alchemist, ultimately for Corbin, as for Dionysus. The divine darkness and divine light are mystically inseparable and simultaneous, and there is a constant interplay between the inaccessible majesty of beauty and the fascinating beauty of inaccessible majesty, what I have called alchemical illumination. For Corbin, this duality is the central feature of all creation. Without the blossoming of beauty as theophanic man, we could not approach the sublimity of the Deus absconditas as a glory of light. Illumination and the resurrection into life requires a step more deeply into the interior of the Via Negativa, a radical Via Negativa described as the annihilation of annihilation, strikingly similar to the Madhyamika logic of the Buddhists, the voiding of the void. For Corbin, this level of negation signifies a recognition of the unknowable in the supreme act of metaphysical renunciation, the real meaning of mystical poverty, Darvish. It is of interest to consider a psychoanalytic parallel other than Jung's to this mystical unity of poverty. In a study of psychoanalysis and mysticism, Mark Kroll-Frattoni compares the work of Jacques Lacan and Meister Eckhart and concludes that Lacan's psychoanalysis and Eckhart's mysticism are guided by a similar logic and structure, and that they are both oriented around the emptying of the self and the process of change. Just as Jung's idea of the self required a defeat for the ego, so Freud recognized that the ego was not master in its own house. Along with the idea of the unconscious came the introduction of another, a mysterious other into the heart of the self, which displaces the centrality of the ego. With Lacan, the notion of the other is radicalized, and it is a view of the unconscious as unknown, which cannot be colonized or trained. For Lacan, the self remains precisely not whole and irreducibly heterogeneous and decentered. It is a lack. It is at the heart of continuous transformation and represents more than a negative moment in a dialectic of consciousness. It precludes any attempt of the ego to constitute itself as a unity. Lacan instead aims at the acceptance of the unconscious as an alien, a radical otherness within the self, intrinsically lacking and self-emptying. In a parallel way, the mystic Eckhart rejects the idea of unity with a static notion of God as being. Instead, he seeks a unity of God with the ongoing act of creation, with a self-emptying kenotic process that awaits the event of God's birth in the soul of man. Such a birthing process does not create wholeness or fullness, but rather opens an abyss, which for Eckhart is the Grund, or ground, or a groundless ground, a non-ontotheologic understanding of God, a mystic view resonant with Lacan's sense of lack. Lacan and Eckhart stay close to this negative and cast doubt on anything positive, any movement toward transcendence that tries to compensate for feelings of anxiety or incompleteness in the face of lack or annihilation is seen as defensively fleeing from the divine or from the finitude. It is a flight from the trauma of the abyss of creatureliness. For Eckhart, releasement is not defending against the abyss. It means letting go of the need for grounds and living without even a need to ask the question why things occur the way they do. To let go of this question approaches the nothingness of death and the Via Negativa, very close to dying. In this regard, it's interesting to recall the last reported words of Timothy Leary before he passed away. It was recorded that at one moment, Leary sat straight up in his bed and said, "Why?" And then, as if to recognize Eckhart's point, there was a long silent pause, and he said much more softly a number of times, "Why not? Why not?" At another moment, as though he were describing something he was seeing, he said, "Beautiful," as if intimating something more in the midst of approaching the nothingness of dying. A few days before he passed, one of his disciples is reported to have asked him, "Who are we?" He responded, "We are bearers of light, light bearers." Another question followed, and he was asked, "What is our purpose?" And he responded, "We can share it to illuminate others." What then to make of Corbin's mystical and Gnostic expression of beauty and pleasure and illumination? Are these simply defenses against the abyss of the Via Negativa, illusions that Lacan would describe as imaginary? I would claim no. In an essay written by Warren Coleman, he makes a distinction between Lacan's view of the imaginary and Corbin's view of the imaginal, real imagination. The imaginary in Lacan's sense emerges as a defense against negation and loss, flees from it, creating a kind of fantasy that Kant called Schwärmen, a kind of madness and undisciplined metaphysical speculation, a land of shadows, nursery tales, and monastic miracles. Such fantasies lack depth, substance, and psychic reality. The real, symbolic, and imaginal are products of the transcendent function rather than of transcendence and consense. From the perspective of the Via Negativa and the Via Negativa, it is also a Via Positiva. Similarly, in alchemy, the prima materia is also an ultima materia, both logical and mystically at one. Such combinations might well be spoken of in the way they are in mystical theology as hyper-essential, divine. Divine darkness and divine light imply one another. Both are superabundant illuminations. I believe that this kind of illumination is what Corbin speaks of. While Lacan and Eckhart resist moving away from the Via Negativa, they both also recognize that the abyss carries another potentiality within itself. Revelations occur in the midst of emptiness. Darkness of the Via Negativa are expressions of a bipolar archetypal reality linking together positive and negative. This bipolarity is at the heart of finitude and lack. There is a considerable similarity between Eckhart's notion of when one enters this Via Negativa of wandering joy and the idea of jouissance. Jouissance, difficult to understand, but in simple terms, it describes a kind of ecstatic sexual joy that is released in the acceptance of castration, lack, finitude, and death as a fundamental truth of our human limits. This acceptance is at the same time a release, an excess of life, a superabundant vitality that he graphically states begins with a tickle and ends with a blazing petrol. This mystical sexual energy linking pain and pleasure has what Freud called a sexual coloring, and what Lacan describes as the color of emptiness in the light of a gap. This gap, it would seem, is a space between human limits and divine plenitude. The experience of both Eckhart and Lacan identifies something that exceeds yet is one with negation. A pleasure in nothingness. The nothing of the ecstatic is also elaborated by Henderson, who shows that in addition to affirmation and negation, Dionysus includes ecstasy as a third dimension of his mystical theology. And it is important to note that mystical experiences of affirmation and negation are not distinct moments in time or aspects of a linear process, but are logically and mystically synonymous and simultaneous. Negation is not a simple opposite of affirmation, but at work in the heart of Dionysus' celebration of the divine. If these mystical and ecstatic experiences occur simultaneously in a moment, it is also the case that we are separated from this moment in our ordinary temporal reality of our lives. We do not live continuously in wandering joy or eternal conjunctio or jouissance. The conjunctio falls apart and we find ourselves outside of this eternity and are mostly unconscious, everyday, all too human beings. How then can we imagine the goals of alchemy and analysis and mystical theology from our egoist position in time as temporal beings in a process of development, growth, and individuation? Alchemy, psychoanalysis, and mystical theology all described initiatory processes and a phenomenology of a path leading to a goal of their respective disciplines. Comprehensive descriptions of these paths and processes are available in the respective literature and tradition of these disciplines. In all of the above, there is a unique individual variation on an archetypal process. There are simply no accurate cookbooks, and we are all thrown back on our unknowing. We enter analysis or spiritual disciplines for guidance. Dreams, fantasies, and visions give us access to the imaginal life, its images and symbols that appear to have a telos, and which Jung describes as the best possible expression of an as yet unknown reality. One might say that the images and symbols stand in the gap between the unknown and the unknown, illuminate us and point the way to our unique possibilities. Illumination is an archetypal expression of the teleological function of symbolic images, as well as a manifestation of the numinosity of consciousness as it discovers its own relationship to its own unknown aspects. It is also an expression of conscious life within darkness itself. Dark light and the light of darkness, the Luminatura, opens us to an uncanny recognition of an autonomous or at least semi-autonomous intelligence to whom we are drawn and who is also drawn to us. Recognition of this otherness can play a role in the unfolding of our lives, call us to a beyond, to a purpose that exceeds our own narcissism and opens us to a larger mystery of the Anima Mundi, or the world soul. It is a critical moment in psychic development when we realize that the unconscious and what we thought was our inorganic material world shows itself to have a consciousness of its own, that it looks back at us as we look at it. Edinger writes, it is a major transition from the discovery of lights shining in the darkness to the discovery of eyes looking at us from within the darkness. He continues, the presence of eyes indicates that the light residing in the unconscious has a subject, and notes that, as Jung has said, the eyes indicate the lapis is in the process of evolution, and growing from these ubiquitous eyes, there is indeed an uncanny moment connected to the archetype of the eye of God. How we relate to this moment can create considerable anxiety. The archetype of the eye of God is bipolar. On the one hand, imagine as God looking after us, seeing us, knowing us, but on the other hand, being watched, being scrutinized, and experienced at the core of paranoia. Edensor suggests that the danger comes when we turn away from this recognition, not looking, or refusing to acknowledge it. When this occurs, the experience of being looked at is replaced by being nagged by an obsessive complex. Understood properly, this moment speaks to the fact that the unconscious requires attention and indicates that the individual is ready for an important step in individuation, ready to relate to the unconscious as a light bringer, and that the ego is not the sole source of light. I remember Edensor once telling me about dreams. After years of looking at them, observing their capacity to point out meaningful insights about the self, he realized that dreams are also looking back at us, that the unconscious other has a subjectivity of its own. Seeing the other as alive can truly be a numinous experience. I'm coming close to ending here, and I'd like to report this dream I had while I was writing the paper. I discover that an animal is living with me. I'm in my den, sitting on a couch. A large, black, sleek panther, or jaguar, comes over to me. He has a shining black coat and golden yellow intense eyes. I look into his eyes and realize that they don't seem to have a pupil, but they are fields of yellow gold lying over one another, the way a camera's aperture opens and shut when a picture is snapped. His head is large and muscular and odd-shaped. I am frightened, but reach out and tentatively touch him, not knowing if he will turn on me, instinctually like a wild animal, or if he will befriend me. He seems to like the attention I am giving him. He stays for a moment, then walks away, and then returns, as if he wants me to stroke him again. I wonder if he has been in the house all along, or if he was ever outside. I wonder about letting him out, but fear he'll run away, or if he'll be a danger to others. At one point, I am stroking him with a pen, pushing into his fur, and he seems to like it, and comes back again as if asking me to do it again. I suspect that the Jaguar as autonomous psyche enjoys being written about, and so as I put my pen to the paper, I feel this jaguar, perhaps a totem animal, accompanies and supports my effort to express something of the illumination present in the Anima Mundi. In this presentation, I have explored some of the mutual overlap and goals between certain psychoanalysts and mystical philosophers and theologians, relying primarily on Jung and Lacan, Pseudo-Dionysus and Henri Corbin. I followed the thread of the Via Negativa in analysis and alchemy and mystical theology and Gnostic imagination. In and through the above traditions, the Via Negativa plays a central role in the emergence and outcome of the experience of transformation. It is this experience of transformation that psychoanalysis and mysticism share. Many of the images of this outcome have been noted, from the soulification of the alchemist to the man of light in Gnostic theophanies, accompanied by an excess of life or an abundant divinity, a wandering joy or jouissance, an ecstasis that opens a divine darkness and a divine light. These experiences of illumination, continuing self-negation, and intrinsic positivity do not lead to any static ontological fixity, but to an ecstatic, ongoing, vital process in the midst of finitude and temporality. Between finitude and eternity, alchemical and mystical illumination in the light of analysis do not erase mystery, but activate and enliven it, making it conscious and a significant part of transformation. For me, mystery, imagination, and wonder can be like a wild animal, integral to psychological work, at a pivot point between being torn apart or being renewed with vitality. I believe it is this vitality that Hillman referenced when he said, "The soul-making had as its goal a resurrection in beauty and pleasure, And for me, it is also a way of imagining what the alchemist Gerhard Dorn may have had in mind when he challenged us to make ourselves living philosophical stones. And that's it. I guess we have questions.
Could you go back? Your piece about jouissance was totally fascinating, but the beginning of that, where you were introducing it, is that as the gap or as the illumination self-negation?
Yeah, what I did was skip over a little bit because I started to get real anxious when I realized that this is very long and perhaps boring. So
No,
I started
it's not in the book.
skipping pieces. But yeah, I mean, the idea of jouissance is very difficult in Lacan. I mean, he develops the idea over a number of his different seminars. And basically, it's also sort of hard to describe. He talks about the jouissance of the other, and he talks about female orgasm, and he talks about receptivity. And it's almost as if I had time to work out some of what I think might be an interesting reflection on Lacan, is that Lacan is hungering after the feminine when so much of his psychology seems to me phallic, that the real jouissance or joy is letting go of the phallic. And for him, the phallic is exactly what we do as a defense against the nothingness. So we produce personas and we produce, the things we're attached to, and we compensate for things. And all that, he realizes, is an escape from the lack. But if in the acceptance of lack and finitude, and in the breakdown of unities and all the ways in which we try to grasp something beyond our finitude, in that very moment, in that very essence, there's a wandering joy, there's a jouissance, there's a sexual energy, there's a vitality of life. And I think that vitality you can trace in Corban and Hillman and a number of other people. So I don't know if I got to your question, but.
I'm just thinking about this idea of duality and the idea of multiplicity that humans adore. So I'm just reflecting about it.
Yes. Well, I've been thinking about that too. It's I tried to talk about it here tonight in a way that tries to make sense of the alchemists, and a lot of the religious thinkers speak of unity and oneness. And yet there is the recognition that there's a lot of ones, a lot of onennesses, that is a multiplicity of understanding. And that maybe in the Via Negativa, we come to some kind of understanding of that play. I did a paper for a Jung journal on, what was it about? It was about the Philosopher's Stone, but it was about James Joyce and Jung's reading of James Joyce. And in that paper, I decide to add the idea that a name for the Philosopher's Stone is chaosmos, which is a unity of chaos and cosmos. So that the unity of cosmos and chaos means that if you bring them together, chaos is constantly deconstructing the unity, and unity is constantly putting together the chaos into oneness. So there's a kind of dual energy principle that is at the heart of the soul and accounts for both unity and multiplicity. So I think that's another name for the Philosopher's Stone. Something like that. Now, just one other note. I don't have time to go on here, but recently in Dallas, and I'd like to talk sometime about, or just so you know, to take a look at Jim Hillman's new writing, where he talks about he's been lost in the Via Negativa and stuck in the image, and that he is trying to move on to a new vision beyond the Via Negativa, beyond just seeing through, into a cosmological sensibility and a living metaphysics. he's returning to that kind of idea, but it's still, it seems to me, very much within the image, but also with the hole in the image, that the image has a hole in it, as Ken Newman said. What happens with that hole in the image where we move from image to thought? And that thought is somehow ensnared in imagination as much as it tries to leave imagination. So it's an interesting tension. And I think Jim was just on the verge of developing that. And Ed Casey has an interesting dialogue with him about that development at the end of Philosophical Investigations, is it, Pat? Do you know? It's Philosophical Investigations. Yeah.
Since you began your paper on a very personal note, I'd like to ask you, if you would, to describe your personal experience on Monday of where you were and what was the experience of seeing the solar eclipse.
There it is. Well, I had a lot of anticipation about the solar eclipse, and I had people writing to me, this is your day. I sent them back a picture of me wearing a Black Sun t-shirt, and in all actuality, I went across the street from my house. I couldn't find glasses in time. They were sold out in Pittsburgh, so I made Cheerio boxes with whatever, and it was a little underwhelming looking into the Cheerio box with a little image. So I went back and, pardon? Yes, the darkness, the coming of the darkness was probably the best part, the sense that it was darkening, Yeah, and I want to thank Dave and Joe for their wonderful presentations. I really enjoyed them. I was very moved by both of them, so thank you. Yeah.